Hey, how's it going? This video is a primer for the Ukraine conflict. I'm making it specifically for people who don't really know what the hell is going on, okay? Because this is like a soap opera, and you're being dropped into the middle of the show, and you're like, who's that guy? And who's that guy? And why does this matter? This video is for those who have no idea about this particular series and want to catch up with all the previous episodes, if you see what I mean. So the Ukraine conflict, you have to understand a little bit about the historical origins of the conflict, and then you have to understand what's happening right now. So first I'm going to do a little bit of historical background so you get the picture, and then I'm going to start talking about the events that have happened since February 24th, which was the start of this conflict, okay? Now, the historical background. See, in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And the Soviet Union internally was divided into Soviet republics. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these republics became independent nations, like the Baltics, like Kazakhstan, like Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, to give you a picture in terms of size, it's roughly the size of France, roughly the size of Texas, okay? It's a big country. I've ridden my motorcycle across all of it. I've been living here, by the way, since 2016. I married a Ukrainian woman that I met when I was living in Paris. And well, here we are, a couple of kids and all the rest of it. But anyway, the point is, see, I know this country, it is huge, okay? Now, the country in and of itself, it has some unique problems in terms of demographics. Because you see, the east and the south of the country is predominantly ethnic Russian, okay? The west and the center, except for the city of Kiev, which is almost dead bang in the middle to the north of the country, well, that is predominantly Ukrainian. Now, these are two ethnic groups that, from an outsider's perspective, frankly, I find them almost impossible to distinguish, but they know each other very well, the narcissism of small differences. So the thing is, in elections starting in 91 and continuing forward, there was this clear divide in the country between those who considered themselves Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainians, and those who considered themselves Ukrainian, but who were ethnic Russians. Now, the thing is, see, the part on the east and to the south has always been richer. It has better agricultural land. It has most of the industrialization of the country. The area of the current conflict, which is the east and the south of the country all the way to Odessa, that accounts for 85% of the GDP of the country, okay? So there was this divide between the two halves. And the divide was almost 50-50, okay? The two populations, and we could see this in election results. Often as not, especially coming into the 2000s, you'd have two candidates, one who was clearly ethnic Ukrainian or appealed more to the ethnic Ukrainians, and one who appealed more to the ethnic Russians. Now, the ethnic Russians would speak Russian. The ethnic Ukrainians would also speak Russian, and some of them would speak Ukrainian. Quite a number of ethnic Ukrainians never learned the Ukrainian language, by the way, okay? The whole country spoke Russian, but starting in the 2000s and so forth, there was this greater impetus of like Ukrainian language only, exclusively, okay? And this will come into play in a little bit. Now, the country, as I said, was divided along these ethnic lines, ethno-linguistic lines, if you will, and it was reflected in the election results. And what happened was that in 2013, there was a president called Yanukovych who had won the previous election, and he was basically kind of like an incompetent, kind of like a buffoon, okay? I mean, he was really like just a silly character, and there are a lot of videos showing his silliness, but that's not important. The point is that, see, he had appealed to the ethnic Russians, and that part of the demographics of the country had put him into power. He was not trying to carry out measures that would hurt the ethnic Ukrainians. He was trying to do a, live and let live, kind of like, kumbaya, we can all live together kind of thing. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying, but for the sake of this primer. Now, the thing is, see, this man, Yanukovych, he was pursuing a two-track policy insofar as his relations with the two largest neighbors, see? Because on the west, he has the European Union, which is rich. And so he wanted to pursue a good policy with the West, of course. But on the other hand, he's got Russia, and most of Ukraine's trade was carried out with Russia. And a lot of people in Ukraine had family in Russia. I mean, like a lot, okay? And so he wanted to pursue, as most countries between two powers will try to pursue, a two-track policy of like playing one off the other kind of thing and trying to get the best deal from each of them. And there was a lot of impetus for Ukraine to join the European Union because a lot of Ukrainians have thought that if Ukraine joined the European Union, it would be the land of milk and honey and everything would be wonderful and so on and so forth. Which is, of course, just fantasy, but that's not the point. These people wanted to join the European Union, and they were, of course, predominantly on the western and central areas of Ukraine, the more ethnic Ukrainian side. Whereas the eastern and southern areas, including the peninsula of Crimea, wanted to pursue a more pro-Russian approach. And Yanukovych was trying to balance between the two. Okay? Now, what happened in 2013 and into 2014 was a color revolution, the Maidan Revolution. Now, what is a color revolution? You see, the West, the Americans specifically, have come up with this very tidy trick to overthrow a government it doesn't like. And it goes as follows. See, they put in NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are ultimately funded by groups like the Open Society, some groups allied to the World Economic Forum, that whole crowd, that are politicized NGOs, and these NGOs install their offices in the targeted country, and they create, they foment agents provocateurs, basically. And so what happens is that in a color revolution, there might be some, civil disturbance, perhaps some minor rioting over a genuine and legitimate issue. But these NGOs, with their agents provocateurs, they amp up these demonstrations and turn them into outright riots. And they try to overthrow the government by way of this rioting, by way of this civil insurgency, if you will. And that's what basically happened in 2014. The Yanukovych government, which was supposed to go for re-election in just a few months, well, it was overthrown in this color revolution. And an individual named Poroshenko was installed as president. Okay, and he was pro-West. He was in favor of closer ties with the West and breaking ties with Russia. Because that was the point of these NGOs that were ultimately puppeteered from Washington and Brussels. The idea was for Ukraine to decide between Russia or the West. And so these NGOs staged this color revolution, the Maidan Revolution, which was supposed to be so wonderful for Ukraine, and it wasn't, okay? I mean, like, after that color revolution, the economy of Ukraine, really cratered, and it's been downhill since then. Ukraine was the second poorest country in Europe, with a population of 45 million people. And the thing is, see, because of the economic disaster that ensued post-Maidan Revolution, a lot of Ukrainians, the more educated Ukrainians, they fled to the West for job opportunities there, okay? Now, in this color revolution, they overthrew Yanukovych and installed Poroshenko. And what happened was that the Russians, they got very, very nervous because they have a major naval base in the Crimean Peninsula, in the city of Sevastopol. And the Russian Empire, pre-Soviet Union, had captured Crimea in 1776 under Catherine the Great. And Crimea was a very important strategic location for Russia because it's its only warm water port. And so it needed Sevastopol, it needed Crimea, the peninsula. Furthermore, the population of Crimea is 95% ethnic Russians. They self-identify, before the Maidan Revolution, they self-identified as Russians, okay? Now, let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Okay, Vladimir Putin is a a very capable leader who did a series of interviews with Oliver Stone, which I suggest you watch. They were quite long. Oliver Stone interviewed him over a number of years and created this documentary. It's really an extraordinary documentary. I mean, as a work of documentary, it's incredible. And it gives incredible insight into Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, he is, for all intents and purposes, what you would call an ethnic nationalist. But he is not an imperialist. This is key. See, when you talk about an ethnic nationalist, you think of the bad old guy in Germany with a little mustache. No, no, no. What Putin, the thing that really stuck in Putin's craw, and it's very apparent in this documentary because he says it a number of times, is that, you see, when the Soviet Union collapsed, something like 30 million ethnic Russians all of a sudden found themselves in a foreign country. Because, you know, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, you know, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, they had substantial ethnic Russian populations. Like I said, in Ukraine, half the population was ethnic Russian, okay? So he always found that a tragedy, that was the tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is not in favor of you know, rejiggering the Soviet Union and create Soviet Union 2. He's not interested in that. But he finds it a catastrophe that all these ethnic Russians are no longer within Russia's borders, which is reasonable. I mean, suppose, just for the sake of argument, that the United States collapsed and say, you know, the state of Texas wound up becoming a separate state. You know, I mean, a lot of Americans would say, look at all those Americans in Texas who are basically in a foreign country now. I mean, it was kind of like that, okay? But he has never tried to carry out any war of conquest, any war of territorial aggression to capture more territory. He's got plenty of territory as it is, you know. And Russia has all the natural resources, rather, that it could ever want. So it's not hurting for natural resources. It's not hurting for territory. But, you know, Vladimir Putin feels, and he has said this repeatedly, and you always should take people at their word in such matters, he has always felt that those ethnic Russians who were left out of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union are people that he, as the leader of Russia, ought to at least look after their best interests as best he can, which is reasonable, okay? But be that as it may. The point is that, see, after the Maidan revolution, I personally call it a coup because it really was a coup d'etat, okay? After the Maidan coup, see, the Russians got very nervous about losing Crimea because they were worried about two things. Number one, they would lose their warm water port. And number two, they were worried that their naval base that's fully geared up, all kinds of equipment, you know, infrastructure and whatnot, would become a NATO naval base. And they didn't want to have NATO naval base right in their underbelly, geographically speaking. Of course not. And the population of Crimea is 95% ethnic Russian. And so what did the Russians do? They grabbed it. And basically, it was more complicated than that, but for purposes of this primer, that's what they basically did. They grabbed it, okay, during the chaos of the Maidan revolution, the Maidan coup. And this outraged the West because, of course, that was the whole reason that they overthrew the Yanukovych regime. They wanted to have Ukraine decisively shift to the West, and so that NATO could take over Crimea and Sevastopol and have NATO ships controlling the Black Sea, which is the only warm water outlet that Russia has for its goods and services, okay? And so, you know, that was the whole purpose for the coup, to grab Crimea. The Russians beat them to it, beat them to the punch, okay? And the West was outraged, and they inflicted all kinds of sanctions on Russia. Now, these sanctions at the time, in 2014, really, really hurt the Russian economy because they were unprepared. Because the Russian economy, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, had been completely westernized. And this is something important. You see, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a political collapse, an economic collapse. And what happened was that a lot of Western NGOs, a lot of Western financiers, a lot of Western advisors came to Russia and, for all intents and purposes, started stripping the country of its wealth. That's what they did. And what they did was, the way that they did it was that they found friendly oligarchs. And these oligarchs were just, you know, guys who just a couple of years before the collapse of the Soviet Union had been driving taxis and shit. I mean, just random nobodies, but very well connected nobodies. And these guys grabbed up on the cheap a lot of very expensive, very valuable assets in Russia, in Ukraine, in all the states that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union. See, this is where the oligarchs come from. And the oligarchs were assisted by the Western advisors, okay? Because the West always talks about those evil Russian oligarchs. Yeah, but who created them in many ways? It was the West in many ways, not exclusively, okay? But that's not important. The important thing is that, see, the 90s in Russia were a complete catastrophe. The people were in misery. You know, the birth rates collapsed to like 1.1 child per woman during that period of time. It was a disaster, demographically speaking, but morally, by psychologically, it was a disaster because the country was being basically strip-mined of all its assets by rapacious Western financiers, you see? And this happened in Russia, and this happened in Ukraine. But there was one difference between Ukraine and Russia, and the difference was Putin. See, Putin was a KGB agent, officer, right? But he wasn't like, you know, doing spy shit. He was like a lawyer, basically, as I understand it. But that's not important. The point is that, see, as I said, he is a Russian nationalist, okay? And so when he took power in '99, the West thought that, oh, he's our guy, because Boris Yeltsin, you know, he was a drunken buffoon. He was pathetic. But here comes this young man, you know, very capable, very quiet, very serious, who seems to know what he's doing. He's very connected with the KGB, and through the KGB, the whole of Russia can be easily controlled, you know. So he seems to be our guy. That's what the West thought. People like John McCain, you know, and a lot of the, you know, the Kagan family, and all those people thought that Putin was our guy, you know, that he would allow this continued rape of Russia that had occurred during the 90s, that he would allow it to continue into the 2000s, right? As they were doing in Ukraine. Because part of the reason Ukraine is so poor is because it's so corrupt. And it's so corrupt because of the oligarchs. The oligarchs in Ukraine basically rule like each of the regions as their own private fiefdom, for crying out loud. And so, you know, they were happy with Putin when he came into power. And Putin, one of the first things that he did was that he gathered all the oligarchs and he told them, look, you have your money situation, that's good on you, but you don't get involved in politics. And this was basically a message not just from Putin, but the KGB cadres that were supporting Putin, okay? Now, these KGB cadres and Putin himself, they laid down the law to these oligarchs. You can make your money, you know, do what you're doing, fine, but don't mess with politics. And Putin and the KGB cadres that were supporting him, and other cadres that were supporting him, but it's not important for this conversation. See, they made sure that these oligarchs in Russia towed the line and never got involved in politics, which was not the case in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the oligarchs, like I said, they had their own private fiefdoms in each of the oblasts, the regions of Ukraine, and, you know, they just sucked out all the resources of Ukraine, and, you know, basically bought themselves villas in Spain and ski chalets in Switzerland and shit like that, and Lamborghinis driving around Milan and so forth, see? Whereas in Russia, the oligarchs were controlled by not being able to get involved in politics. And what happened, of course, is that Putin slowly started undermining the oligarchs in Russia. And the pro-Western oligarchs, like Abramovich and a few others, you know, they fled to the West. Right? The ones who stayed, they had to knuckle under the new rules of the Russians. And eventually, you know, Putin neutralized the oligarchs and was able to create a unified state under the control of the Kremlin. Because historically, Russia has always been a top-down, pyramid-type country. Because it is so expansive, it's so diverse in terms of ethnic populations. Not as much as people think, by the way, but that's another conversation. And it has all kinds of problems, and it's basically more useful to have a centralized leadership as opposed to all divided up into little fiefdoms, right? And so Putin very slowly and systematically edged out all the oligarchs in Russia, and he created enormous prosperity for the Russian people. That's why Russia took off in the 2000s and into the 2010s, whereas the Ukraine just ground down into misery and just patheticism, to coin a word. Okay. Okay. So what happens is that, see, Russia is doing very well. And in 2007, Putin gave a very important speech at Munich, at this conference of world leaders and so forth. And in this conference, he basically outlined the thing that the unipolar world that had existed in the West, starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the unipolar world would be ending and it would be a multipolar world. I mean, he outlined this, and he thought that the unipolar world had been arrogant, which is true, and that the unipolar world was unfair, which is also true, and that the unipolar world could not exist indefinitely because other countries, Russia, China, India, they were rising, and there would need to be a more equitable distribution of geopolitical power. And this outraged the neocons in Washington in particular. John McCain was at that speech, and if you see a video of it, as he's listening to what Vladimir Putin is saying, who was supposed to be our guy, and he's basically telling them, fuck you. You can see the daggers coming out of his eyes. It's really fucking funny. But anyway, the point. See, in 2013-14, there was the Maidan coup, and there was a region that was exceptionally pro-Russian, two regions rather, Lugansk and Donetsk. Now, these are two south and slightly eastern regions in Ukraine, which of course had very heavily ethnic Russian populations. I mean, something like 70% or something like that, or perhaps a little bit more, as a matter of fact. Not as much as Crimea, but they wanted to join the Russian Federation. Now, just like Crimea had joined the Russian Federation, okay? And so what happened was that the Poroshenko regime dispatched the Ukrainian army to put down that separatist movement. And that's where the first Ukraine war started. The first war of the Donbass, because that area, Lugansk, Donetsk, is called the Donbass, okay, for historical reasons that don't matter in this conversation. And the thing is, see, they tried to put down this, this rebellion. And there was a homegrown militia, certainly aided and abetted by the Russians, but really homegrown. I mean, people who actually lived in the Donbass, who started resisting this. And there was wars and, battles and the whole thing at a much smaller scale than what is happening now, but they were happening, okay? And the separatists were winning. That's the key issue. They were winning. And so the French and the Germans tried to negotiate a peace settlement. And they convinced Russia to, be associated to this peace process, and it was called the Minsk Agreements because they were done out of Minsk in Belarus. Okay, and basically it was that the Ukraine government would give more autonomy to the Donbass region, but would not allow it to separate, but would give it more autonomy, allow it to use the Russian language, because the Kiev regime, when it took over, the Poroshenko regime, when it took over, it imposed strict language requirements. Everybody had to speak Ukrainian. Every government document would be in Ukraine only, no Russian, And there were other measures, suppressing of Russian language television stations, stuff like that. And so the Minsk agreements were basically a way to have long-term peace and stability in the region of the Donbass. And it was because of the Minsk agreements that there was a ceasefire, and the Donbass militias, which were winning, were basically told to pull back. And, there was going to be a long-term peace agreement. But what happened was that the Kiev regime never implemented the Minsk agreements. On the contrary, starting in 2014, the Kiev regime started heavily fortifying the area that bordered Ukraine with the separatist region of the Donbass, heavily fortifying it, which is what we're seeing now. The battles that are taking place are in those fortifications, you see? And what also happened was that starting in 2014-15, the West started supplying the Kiev regime with all kinds of weapons, with all kinds of training, the Kiev regime also grew its military enormously. I mean, it just went through the roof as they built this very, very large army. And throughout this time, they were constantly shelling the regions of the Donbass, the cities of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, and they were shelling them, and 16,000 people died after 2015 up until the start of this conflict. That's something that the Western media will never tell you, see? Because what they were doing was that they were trying to basically terrorize the Donbass into relenting, into not being separatists anymore, okay? They were trying to attract them by way of this relentless shelling that happened all the time, and it affected civilians. Thousands of civilians were killed. 1,000 children or 800 children were killed because of this relentless shelling of civilian areas. And they knew that they were civilian, right? And so, okay, so we come to 2021. And in 2021, what starts happening is that the Russians start making these moves because there's a lot of political pressure from the West for the Kiev regime to take over the Donbass, to take over it definitively. Because what the West is thinking is that they really want Crimea. That's all they really want, Crimea. They don't give a shit about the rest of Ukraine. They want Crimea so that they can have the Black Sea, so they can have a dagger underneath Russia's belly. Okay, and so the Russians, they see that this is coming. Okay, and they had been hurt very badly by the economic sanctions that had been imposed on them in 2014 because of their annexing of Crimea, because the Kiev regime never accepted that Crimea had been annexed, and the West didn't accept it, and that was the excuse for these sanctions, which hurt the Russian economy badly. Now, while the West was arming the Kiev regime, what did the Russians do? Well, the Russians were under no illusions, or at least they're very prepared people, because what they started to do, the Putin regime, they started doing multiple things. Number one, they started to sanction-proof their economy. See, the Western economies depend on several institutional and structural issues that allow it to wield enormous economic leverage over any country around the world. Specifically, the capital markets, insofar as the transfer of money is concerned. The SWIFT system, you've probably heard that quite a bit. Now, the SWIFT system is it's a messaging system, okay? It's a messaging system to send money between banks. And if you're on that system, it's easy to transfer funds between the two banks. If you're not on the system, you can't transfer your money from one bank to another. And therefore, this affects foreign trade, see? Because somebody who's trading in something, they go to their bank and say, I have money, I need it to put in that bank over there in that other country because I'm buying something. And, that's how it works. And that's how the West has had enormous leverage over all of the economies of the world by way of these institutional factors, these structural factors, the financial infrastructure. Okay. Now the Russians, what did they start to do? They started to create a parallel messaging system within their own country, within their own banks. They also started to create their own credit card systems and other payment systems to detach themselves economically from the West. Because these sanctions, as I say, they really hurt the economy of Russia back in 2014. And so they started to detach themselves and economically. And they also started rearming at a very, very fast rate. They started rearming, building a bigger army, doing all the things necessary for a potentially prolonged conflict. That's what the Russians did. Whereas the West, it started arming Kiev. And so you see where I'm going here. This war that's happening now, it didn't come out of the blue. It was, in the post for quite some time. Now in 2001, a lot of this tension started to escalate for various reasons that aren't very important. But finally what happened was, and probably the trigger, there were probably two triggers for the Russians. Number one, in January of 2022, the current president, Zelensky, who is an actor, and he was actually put in power by oligarchs, an oligarch called Ihor Kolomoisky, and other people as well. This actor went to Munich to another conference of world leaders, and in that conference he started saying that Ukraine ought to have nuclear weapons, and nobody said anything. Everybody was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, and scared the shit out of the Russians, number one, because, they don't want nukes in Ukraine, just as like the United States would not want Chinese nukes in Mexico, right? And so he said that, but much more seriously, what became apparent was that the Kiev regime had put a huge number of troops just across the contact line in front of the Donbass. Okay, the separatist region of the Donbass, right, here on your screen, right, the line of contact between the rest of Ukraine and the Donbass region, that's what it's called, the line of contact. And on the Ukraine side, the Ukrainians had not only been fortifying it for 8-9 years by that point, they also started amassing an enormous number of troops. And the Russians, I mean, this at the time was not known. It's become known after the fact. But the Russians realized what it was. It was an invading army. The Ukraine forces, the Kiev regime, was getting ready to invade the Donbass. And they were going to carry out an ethnic cleansing of the Donbass region, because something else that people don't talk about. See, the Kiev regime, starting with the Maidan Revolution, who were the people that the NGOs financed? They were neo-Nazis. That's the thing. See, the NGOs that carry out color revolutions, they always support the most extreme faction, because the most extreme faction of any given country is the one most willing to turn to violence to overthrow the regime. See, a moderate opposition party is not going to think about using violence. They're going to try to achieve their political goals by political means. But the radical crazies, they're going to go to violence. And so that's who was supported in the Maidan revolution, the Maidan coup. The neo-Nazi crazies, and they are neo-Nazis. Don't kid yourself. Okay? So, you know, the Azov battalion, they proudly wear their swastikas. That's how the Russians can tell when they capture prisoners, you know, which one are the real crazies, because they have their Nazi tattoos on. I'm not kidding. So anyway, in 2022, right, the Russians realized that the Kiev regime was about to invade the Donbass, and they were going to carry out this ethnic cleansing of Russians because they had said so. The Kiev regime had said repeatedly, different spokespeople of the Kiev regime had said that they wanted to wipe all the Russians out of the Donbass and make it pure Ukraine, 100% ethnic Ukraine, when historically, for the last 250, 300 years, it had been ethnic Russian, okay? And the Kremlin was not going to have that. And so just as the Kiev regime was going to launch its offensive to recapture the Donbass, where they were going to launch in mid-March of 2022, well, the Russians launched the special military operation in February 24th of 2022. They beat them to the punch, again, just like in Crimea, okay? Now, the invasion, a lot of people say that the invasion was a failure and this and that because the Russians came with an expeditionary force of 190,000 troops compared to the Ukraine army, which at the time numbered something like 240,000 troops, okay? Not including other territorial defense forces, police forces, and other than that. If you add all of those up, it's 600,000, right? But just like the standing army, they had 240,000, and the Russians came in on basically 6 different fronts, if you count them, 4 to 6, depending on how you count it. They came in with 190,000 troops, right? And it was supposed to be like this lightning strike and capture. And the goal of the Russians was to scare the Kiev regime into settling quickly, and implementing the Minsk II agreements, see? Because they've done this before. In other breakaway areas of Russia, in Georgia and so forth, they have done something similar. And it's worked for them. It worked very effectively. In fact, it did work in the south of Ukraine. They launched these offensives that were quick, deep, to capture certain key command centers and cities. And in the south, it worked. That's why they captured Kherson, for instance. They captured it in the first couple of days, okay? And it worked because the leadership there fled. And what the Russians clearly thought would happen, sorry about that, is that the Kiev regime would also either sue for peace quickly or abandon ship and flee the city. But what happened was that the Kiev regime stayed put in Kiev. I mean, I was there when the war broke out, so I know. And but in the south, this strategy worked. And that's why the Russians were able to capture this huge swath of territory in the south, okay? Roughly 100,000 square kilometers, which is, I don't know, 4 times the size of Massachusetts, basically. And they captured this territory, but in the north, around Kiev, it didn't work. They never intended to capture Kiev because they didn't have enough troops. Kiev is a large city, 2.7 million people, I believe. And so capturing such a large city with the number of troops that they had there, which is basically amounted to about 30,000, that was not an invading army. It was basically to scare the Kiev regime into a quick peace and implementing the Minsk agreements. That's the key issue, because that's what the Russians have always wanted. They wanted, an acknowledgement that Crimea was Russian forevermore, and they wanted some political autonomy and protection for the ethnic Russians in the Donbass. That's what they wanted, okay? That's why the Minsk II agreements came into play. But anyway, the point is that in the south it worked, in the north it failed. And what happened was that during March, the Russians and the Ukrainians started negotiating to some sort of ceasefire, okay? They were trying to get to a peace settlement. And in late March, early April, they seem to have come awfully close. Retrospectively, it appears that they came close to some sort of agreement. And that's why the Russians started to pull back in the north, around Kiev and around Sumy and Chuhuyev. It appeared that a settlement would be reached, and that's why they pulled back out of a measure of, it was two factors. Number one, their supply lines were too long, and so it was smart to start pulling troops back or else go in big, right? And number two, they seemed to be close to this agreement, so it was a measure of good faith. But of course, what happened was in early April, Boris Johnson arrived in Kiev and laid down the law for the Zelensky regime. No peace negotiation. You got to go to war with these guys and go all the way. And the signal for that, remember that human rights atrocity that happened in that suburb of Kiev? That was staged, okay? That wasn't the Russians, okay? But that's a long conversation. That's for another video. But the point is that, that was a turning point for the Russians realizing, no, these guys are never going to sign any kind of peace agreement. They want to go to war. And so the Russians, basically starting from there, they started creating the conditions so that they can go to war and ultimately capture the whole country. They didn't want to capture all of Ukraine, okay? They didn't even want to capture part of it. They just wanted the implementation of the Minsk II agreements. The West will deny this. And me saying this makes me automatically some sort of Putin apologist or Putin stooge or agent of the Kremlin or some shit like that. I haven't gotten any checks, man. So I'm telling you, this is what happened. Now, the Russians started reorganizing their armies, their strategies, their whole approach to the conflict. And for various reasons, they realized that this was going to be a war of attrition, and that they would have to go for broke and reduce and eliminate and destroy, quite frankly, the Ukraine army, which they have been doing, okay? The last credible numbers as of last week, the numbers of Ukraine dead, according to Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who was Donald Trump's military advisor and a guy who's very plugged in, and he's a very sober man. He's never going to say something unless he's absolutely sure of the numbers. He said that 157,000 Ukraine soldiers had been killed in the conflict so far. 157,000. And that's killed. That's not wounded, incapacitated, which is easily double that number. So roughly 450,000 Ukraine men have been lost to this conflict. That's a reasonable estimate at this time. And so far as the Russians are concerned, the BBC has been trying to figure out the numbers very diligently because, of course, the propaganda value. They want to show that the Russians have been losing so much in this conflict in terms of lives, right? And they have been very clever using, apparently, AI to scan all of social media in Russia to find out all the dead in Russia, because of funerals and different, memorial services and stuff like that. And they've come to the conclusion that the Russians have lost roughly 20,000 men, at most, 20,000 killed in action. 157,000 killed in action versus 20,000. That's an 8-to-1 ratio. On top of that, the Russians, starting in September, they got really serious. They brought in a general called Surovikin, who's a very capable commander. He fought in the Syrian conflict for the Russians. And he was placed in overall charge of this conflict. There was later a reorganization, and a lot of people say that, oh, he was demoted or something like that. And no, it was just basically administrative reorganization of the military command structure of the Russians that affects nothing insofar as this conflict is concerned. So Surovikin was put in charge, and they also called up 300,000 reservists. That's the number the Russians claim, but it's probably likely much higher. I would guesstimate that it was probably, 500,000 to 650,000, somewhere in that ballpark. There were also 70,000 volunteers. Now, this call-up in the West, they say that they're all conscripts. No, they're not conscripts. The Russians called up the equivalent of the American National Guard, okay? Those weekend warriors who are, many of them veterans, and they're signed up to the National Guard, and they go running around in tanks and helicopters and shit, a couple of weeks every year. Yeah, basically the equivalent of the Russians. They called up those troops. Those guys are already trained soldiers, okay? And gave them a quick 2-3 week refresher course, and they've assembled this army. Right now, around Ukraine, there is an army that the last credible estimate about a month ago was that it was about 540,000 troops. By this time, it's probably closer to 650,000. It's enormous. It's in southern Belarus. There's about 100,000 or more there. On the northern border of Ukraine, there's also a huge deployment here. I'm in Kharkov, which is about 40 kilometers from the eastern border of Ukraine, the western border of Russia. Right across the border in the area of Belgorod, there's also another huge army. And to the south, there's also a third huge army. The Russians have amassed this enormous concentration of forces, and they are steadily grinding away at the Donbass. Now, why has the war taken so long? Well, because the Russians, first of all, in this kind of warfare against heavily fortified positions, it takes a long time to grind through them and clear them out. It's not a simple matter, okay? And you need artillery, a lot of artillery. And see, this goes against NATO doctrine, because NATO doctrine had never anticipated that a big war would be industrial on this scale, that you would need so many thousands of artillery shells. The Russians are sending over 20,000 artillery rounds per day, 20,000 per day, relentlessly, okay? And, the Ukraine stores of ammunition and weaponry and so forth, they got ground down. Why do you think the West is now sending them tanks and scrounging around everywhere for ammunition and stuff? Because the Russians have tried it. It's been a war of attrition, and they've ground down the Ukraine forces. And if these numbers of killed in action are accurate by Douglas Macgregor, which I have no reason to doubt him, well, the Ukraine armed forces is just a skeleton of what it used to be. Likely, this war would have ended in August had it not been for the Western the Western troops, because the West has been putting in troops. There have been Poles, there have been Romanians, there have been Americans, there have been Australians, there have been Brits, and this isn't something that I'm making out of the hat. A lot of these guys Westerners who have fought in Ukraine, they've given YouTube videos about this. This is known. This is not like some secret information, okay? The Poles seem to be the biggest group of foreign soldiers in Ukraine, and different people say that it's between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers, and at least 2,500 of them have been killed in action so far. Anyway, what is happening now with Bakhmut? Okay, because there's a lot of talk about Bakhmut. Now, Bakhmut is a very key city, and also Ugledar. Two very key cities that are about to fall to the Russians. Now, why are they important? Because they are transportation hubs. In and of themselves, the cities are trivial. I mean, Bakhmut is a town or city of 75,000 people before the war. In and of itself, it's not important. What's important is that it is a transportation nexus. And so the Ukraine forces have been putting everything into Bakhmut, and the Russians have been grinding them down. And right now we are at a stage that the Kiev regime has bet the ranch on Bakhmut and Ugledar to a lesser extent. And once these two cities fall, the next line of defense that the Ukraine has is just going to be practically a tripwire for the Russian army. So at this time, once Bakhmut falls, which would be in the next, nobody really knows, But if you said between 1 week and 4 weeks, it's something around that area. But it will eventually fall. It's inevitable because the Russians are just methodically grinding away. They're not launching these big arrow offensives. They're just every day shelling and advancing little by little, inch by inch. And once they have broken through and captured Bakhmut and potentially encircled a fairly large agglomeration of Ukrainian soldiers there, it's going to be, it's going to be the death blow of the Kiev regime, okay? And that's why in the West they're panicking, and they're talking about sending tanks, sending F-16s, sending all kinds of stuff, because the war is coming to an end, and they realize it. And it's become impossible to hide, because they've been able to hide the number of casualties. They've been able to hide and pretend that when Russia pulls back from some area, it's some great victory. It's not. The Russians have pulled out of two areas. The Kharkov region area, near where I am, as a matter of fact, they pulled out, and everybody in the West said this was a great victory, the victory at Kharkov, right? And it wasn't. What happened was that the Russians had a skeleton force there. They pulled back to the Oskol River for a more defensible position, and the Ukraine army advanced to that area, and they got annihilated. They lost something like 6,000 troops there, killed in action in that advance, that victory, and the Russians didn't lose anything. Or practically anything. And the same happened in the city of Kherson. The Russians had captured the city of Kherson, and they had organized and everything, and they realized, we're going to have to pull back because it's not an easily defensible position. And so they pulled out of Kherson. The Kiev regime advanced, and they haven't been able to hold the city because they're under consistent Russian fire, because the Russians understand something that the West does not understand. See, that a war is not fought for territory. A war is fought to destroy the opposing army. That's the whole point of war, see? Because once you annihilate the opposing army, you can capture his territory. Yeah, it's no trick, see? So if you have to give up some territory in order to advance insofar as destroying your enemy, fine. We'll give up territory, and we'll let the West pretend that there was this great victory at Kharkov or this great victory at Kherson when there was no such thing. It was a operational retreat that forced the Ukrainians to advance and get annihilated, get the shit kicked out of them. Okay, and I'm kind of laughing, but it's tragic because these poor men walked into a trap. That's basically what happened. See, so anyway, overall, the war is winding down. Okay, and the Russians with this huge army, you don't amass an army this size for no reason. Okay, the Russians have a clear intention with this huge force that, as I said previously, is something like over 500,000 men. And so what is their purpose? Well, a lot of people are saying that it's going to be like some sort of attack from the north, from Belarus, slicing off western Ukraine and cutting all transportation from the west to Kiev, or something like that. I mean, I personally think that it's an occupying force. That's what I personally think. But it doesn't really matter. We'll see as the episodes ensue of this particular drama, right? The point where we are right now, see? You see, in the West, all of the propaganda has said that Zelensky is a hero, a Winston Churchill figure, and the Kiev regime are just angels and stuff like that. No, they're bloodthirsty murderers, the Kiev regime. I'm telling you right now. These people are neo-fascist, neo-Nazis. And you say to me, well, how is that possible? Zelensky is Jewish. I mean, he would never ally himself with neo-Nazis. No, dude, it doesn't really matter. I mean, they don't care that he's Jewish, okay? They hate Russians, okay? So if they need some Jewish guy to pretend to be president, because he's not actually the president, he's not actually the leader in the things that really matter, right? The West is the one puppeteering Zelensky, right? They don't care. They just want to kill Russians because they hate Russians, because they are individuals whose soul is black with hatred, okay? And they want to destroy all the ethnic Russians who were living in the Donbass. They talked about it openly. These are the descendants of the people who were Nazi collaboratists back in the Second World War. These are the people we're talking about here, okay? I mean, these are scum of the earth. I don't give a fuck. It's the truth. They are Nazi scum. I mean, real fascists, right? Now, are the Russians angels? Certainly not, They've got some bad apples like everybody, and some of them a lot of bad apples, sure. But in this particular conflict, see, this was something created by the West because the West wanted Crimea so badly. And they still talk about Crimea. They can't let go of that particular bone because they want Crimea at all costs, because they want to be able to have something hanging over the Russians' head. Now, here's the funny thing that has happened. As soon as the war started, the West started with all these sanctions, right? These sanctions against Russia. But the Russians, since they'd been preparing for like 7 odd years, when the sanctions actually took place, it didn't affect them. Not one little bit. At first, yeah, in the panic, sure, the ruble shot up and all kinds of things, and the Moscow stock market tanked and all that. But long term, the Russian economy is doing fine. They're doing better than ever. Because what has happened is that all of their exports that previously were going to Europe, they're going to India, especially India, and also China. And the Russians, yeah, they're being deprived of their iPhones and their BMWs, but so what? They've got other consumer goods from China and India as well. So it hasn't really affected the Russian economy. Even the IMF admits this fact. And people are starting to realize that the sanctions that the West imposed to try to absolutely annihilate the Russian economy, which is really a declaration of war, if you think about it, and war in all but name, well, it hurt the European and American economy far more than it hurt the Russian economy. You know? The Russian economy is sailing on, sailing on. European economy, people are starting to die of hypothermia in the UK because they don't have access to the cheap energy of Russia from before. See? And so everything that the West has thrown at the Russians has boomeranged right back at them. And so now they're panicking and they're trying to figure out a way out of this situation. And they figured that if they throw more tanks, it'll help. It won't help. The Ukrainians, they had like something like 2,000 tanks before the start of this conflict. You think a couple of hundred now is going to help? I mean, why are they asking them? Because those 2,000 tanks are gone. That's basic, you know? And so what, a couple of hundred, maybe 300 tanks, is that going to change the outcome of the conflict? No, it won't. The Russians are just going to destroy them. Because what's happened also is that in this war, a lot of preconceived notions as to what was militarily effective, well, a lot of these illusions have been dispelled. Tanks don't mean shit if you've got drones and precision artillery. Because tanks are no longer fighting tanks. Tanks are fighting artillery with the drones. The drones spot the tanks and pinpoint where the tank is, even if it's moving, and the artillery clocks it right on the money. So it doesn't matter how sophisticated your tank is, you know, it's got all kinds of gear and stuff and armor plating and all this bullshit. Who gives a fuck? One artillery round will knock out that tank, okay? And the same with planes. I mean, look, it's really changed the whole notion of modern warfare. And what has proved to have happened is that the Russian approach of high quantity, very simple, basic gear is the right approach. Because as Stalin himself said, you know, quantity has a quality all its own. And see, the Russians, you know, in the West are talking about the Russians doing human wave tactics. You know, those BBC figures are correct, that the Russians have lost not more than 20,000 men against almost 160,000 Ukrainian killed in action. Then clearly the Russians are not using human wave tactics. On the contrary, the fact that they retreated from Kherson and from Kharkov because they wanted to protect those soldiers that they had occupying those areas, and they saw no benefit into holding on to that terrain. Well, it proves that the Russians are very concerned about husbanding their resources and not frittering away the lives of their soldiers, which is not the strategy of the West, or the strategy that the West has imposed on the Kiev regime. Because the Kiev regime is using human wave tactics. And you're going to start to see, as I've realized, is that a lot of times when the West accuses the Russians of doing something, it's usually projection. It's usually that the West is doing what they're accusing the Russians of doing. See? Now, is there going to be an end to this conflict? Well, there isn't going to be a rapprochement between Russia and Europe. The ties between Europe and Russia have been broken forever. And it wasn't the Russians, it was the Europeans. The Europeans wanted this divorce with all their sanctions and stuff, and all the Russophobia. Mm? And so there's never going to be a rapprochement between Europe and Russia. And so Europe is going to be forever deprived of cheap Russian energy. Mm? That's a fact. And even if they wanted to get the energy back, the Nord Stream pipelines, they were destroyed by the Americans. The Americans, the Brits, and the Poles probably were involved in the operation itself, but it was a decision taken in Washington. And Victoria Nuland a couple of days ago practically bragged to Ted Cruz that they had taken out the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, right? And so, look, there is never going to be cheap energy going from Russia to Europe. Europe is toast economically. And the Russians have pivoted economically so decisively towards India and China. And during this conflict, the other countries have seen Western actions against Russia, like seizing the foreign reserves of the Russian central banks, cutting off and deliberately trying to destroy the Russian economy. And they're realizing, hey, if we become targeted by the West, what the West has done to Russia, they're going to do to us. So it's smart for us to start breaking away from the Western financial system, i.e. the American financial system. And the American economy, because it's an over-indebted economy, it depends on the rest of the world using dollars. But because of these measures that the United States and the West has imposed on Russia, it scared the other countries like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, like India, and certainly China. And they are pivoting away from the American financial system. And as they pivot away, they buy less dollars. They buy less dollar debt. That is, they stop propping up the American economy. You see? So you see how this conflict is emerging? And you understand how at the start of this conflict for the Russians, this was existential, because for them, having Ukraine be a part of NATO was an existential crisis, because they could not have nuclear weapons in Ukraine that could hit Moscow in under 5 minutes. They couldn't allow that to happen. That's why for the Russians, Ukraine was a red line, see? And so for the Russians, at the start of this conflict, this was existential, but it wasn't for the West. Yet the West made it an existential crisis for themselves. And now, because they have so antagonized the Russians and have so scared the rest of the world, essentially the West has lost already. Even if they somehow magically had some sort of military victory here in Ukraine, the long-term effects on the Western economies, is going to be profound. And that's why you in the West now are suffering inflation. You're going to suffer, an impossibility to pay your electric bills and your heating bills. You're having supply chain issues. All of this. You understand? Anyway, I'm going to end here because I've gone on for almost 50 minutes, and I hope that I've given you like an overall view of this conflict. Okay? This is really World War III. This is real World War III. Because this conflict is not going to end here in Ukraine. It's going to continue. And next up to bat is probably the Israeli-Iran conflict, and certainly within the next couple of years, where you're going to see the Americans go toe-to-toe with the Chinese. The Americans are already saying this, and the Chinese have been put on notice. So this is the direction of travel. This is World War III that we are involved in. Okay? It started here, but it's not about this country, Ukraine. What it is the collapsing power of the United States, and as it collapses in its power, it is thrashing out, trying to hold on to that power, and picking fights with other countries so as to pull them down. Paradoxically thinking that if you pulled them down, the American economy and the American state and the American power will resurge. But it won't, you see? This is overall what's happening. It's the Americans panicking at their loss of power, lashing out, and creating chaos around the world. And the rest of the world is essentially aware of this. And that's why we're going to have these conflicts. It's not going to end here in Ukraine, even though the war here in Ukraine will probably not last that much longer. It's going to continue. And it's going to end with the American-Chinese war. Understand what's going on.